The first thing they saw was the shotgun hanging across my chest. The second thing they noticed was that I wasn't backing down. 3 HOA agents had arrived at my beach cabin, convinced they were about to force me off my own property. 10 minutes later, they were running back to their vehicles, and the confidence they arrived with had completely disappeared. My beach cabin sits alone on a quiet stretch of coastline, far from crowded neighborhoods and tourist traffic. My grandfather built it decades ago with his own hands. Every wooden plank, every weathered beam, and every inch of that property carries family history. Long before expensive developments appeared along the shoreline, that cabin was already standing against storms, high tides, and time itself. For years, life there was peaceful. I spent my mornings watching the sunrise over the ocean, and my evenings listening to waves crash against the shore. The nearest subdivision was nearly a mile away, and most of the residents rarely paid attention to my property. That changed when a luxury community called Ocean Crest Estates was built beyond the dunes. The development grew quickly. New houses appeared every few months. Expensive vehicles filled the streets. Before long, an HOA was formed to manage the neighborhood. At first, their rules only applied to their residents. But as property values increased, the HOA board became obsessed with expanding its influence. Unfortunately for them, my cabin sat directly between their neighborhood and a section of private beachfront they desperately wanted access to. One morning, I received a letter from the HOA president. The document claimed the board was interested in discussing a community improvement project involving coastal access. It sounded harmless enough, so I agreed to meet. A few days later, the HOA president arrived with 2 board members. They stood on my porch smiling politely, but their real intentions became obvious within minutes. They explained that Ocean Crest Estates planned to build a private beachfront recreation area for residents. According to their proposal, my cabin occupied what they called a strategic location for future development. Then they made their offer. The amount they proposed wasn't even close to the property's actual value. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was insulting. My family had owned that land for generations. The cabin wasn't for sale, and no amount of pressure would change that. The smiles disappeared immediately. The HOA president informed me that refusing the offer might create complications in the future. She claimed new environmental reviews, property inspections, and compliance concerns could become issues. I knew exactly what she was doing. It wasn't a negotiation anymore. It was a threat. I calmly told them the answer was still no. They left without another word. Over the following weeks, strange things began happening. Anonymous complaints were filed against my property. Notices appeared in my mailbox, claiming I was violating regulations that didn't apply to me. I received letters demanding inspections and warnings about potential enforcement actions. Every claim fell apart. The moment I checked the facts, none of the notices had legal authority. None of the alleged violations were valid, but the HOA kept sending them anyway. It became clear they weren't trying to enforce rules. They were trying to wear me down. Most people would have given up eventually. That was their mistake. The longer they pushed, the more determined I became. I gathered property records, shoreline surveys, county documents, and decades of ownership history. Every piece of paperwork confirmed the same thing. The cabin belonged to me, the land belonged to me, and the HOA had absolutely no authority over either one. When their letters stopped working, their tactics became more aggressive. One afternoon, I returned from town and discovered survey flags planted near my property line. The flags hadn't been placed there by county officials. They had been placed by someone working for the HOA. That was the moment I realized this situation was becoming dangerous. Someone was attempting to create the appearance of authority where none existed. I removed every flag and documented everything with photographs. The next morning, another notice appeared on my door. This one was different. It claimed the HOA had approved a coastal access initiative and that my cabin was interfering with an authorized development corridor. The document demanded immediate cooperation. At the bottom was a warning. Failure to comply could result in enforcement action. I read the notice twice. Then I folded it and placed it inside a drawer, because people who rely on intimidation always make the same mistake. They assume fear will do the work for them. A week later, just after sunrise, I looked out toward the access road and saw several vehicles heading directly toward my property. The moment I saw them, I knew this wasn't another letter. This time, they had decided to show up in person. And what happened next would become the biggest mistake the HOA ever made. The deputies arrived just minutes after the HOA agents backed away from my porch. By then, the hydraulic tool sat abandoned in the sand, and the men who had come so confidently were suddenly struggling to explain why they were standing on private property with equipment meant for forced entry. I handed the deputies copies of my deed, property survey, and the notice the HOA had sent demanding I leave within 24 hours. One deputy read through the paperwork, then looked directly at the HOA representative. "You have no authority here," he said flatly. "This is a private property dispute, and from what I'm seeing, you're the ones trespassing." The confidence drained from their faces instantly. For the first time, they realized they weren't dealing with someone who would simply fold under pressure. The deputies ordered everyone except me to leave the property immediately. The agents argued. They insisted they were acting on behalf of the community. They claimed they had every right to enforce their regulations. None of it mattered. The law wasn't on their side. As their vehicles disappeared down the sandy trail, I stood on my porch watching the ocean roll in. Most people would have thought the fight was over. It wasn't. People who are used to getting their way rarely accept defeat the first time. 3 days later, a courier arrived carrying 2 envelopes. The first contained a legal notice claiming I had agreed to sell my beach cabin to a private buyer. The second accused me of threatening HOA personnel and interfering with authorized community projects. I read every page carefully. The supposed sales contract included my signature, except it wasn't my signature. Whoever forged it had done a poor job. Even worse, the document carried the stamp of a notary who had passed away years earlier. That's when I realized this had never been about rules or regulations. It was an organized attempt to steal property. I immediately contacted my attorney. Within hours, we began gathering evidence. Every notice, every letter, every email, every recorded interaction went into a growing file. Then something unexpected happened. One of the workers who had come to my property during the attempted seizure contacted me privately. He asked if we could meet. When he arrived, he looked nervous, like a man carrying something heavy. After a long silence, he admitted the HOA had targeted other property owners before. According to him, they used intimidation, false violations, fabricated fines, and legal tricks to pressure owners into surrendering land. Some fought back. Others couldn't afford to. Then, he handed me exactly what I needed. He had photographs of internal HOA documents, meeting notes, emails, planning records. In several of them, my property was described as the final obstacle, standing in the way of a luxury beachfront expansion project. There were discussions about forcing compliance, creating pressure campaigns, and finding ways to remove me from the land. My attorney stared at the evidence for several minutes before speaking. "This changes everything," she said. What followed happened fast. The evidence was submitted to county investigators. Financial records were reviewed. Property transfer attempts were traced. Investigators discovered forged documents, fraudulent filings, and coordinated efforts involving multiple HOA officials. What began as a property dispute quickly became a criminal investigation. The people who thought they were untouchable suddenly found themselves answering questions they couldn't explain. Several weeks later, arrest warrants were issued. The AAAA president, 2 board members, and a contractor involved in the forged paperwork were all taken into custody. Investigators uncovered a pattern stretching back years. Other homeowners came forward with stories of suspicious fines, forced agreements, and threats that sounded almost identical to what had happened to me. Piece by piece, the entire operation unraveled. The criminal cases were only the beginning. Civil lawsuits followed. Former homeowners demanded compensation. Records were reopened. Properties that had been taken through questionable tactics were reviewed. The AAA's finances were frozen, and state authorities eventually stripped the association of its enforcement powers. The organization that had spent years bullying people collapsed under the weight of its own actions. Months later, I stood on the same porch where those agents had first appeared. The ocean looked exactly the way it always had. The waves rolled toward shore. The gulls drifted overhead. The cabin remained exactly where my grandfather built it decades earlier. The difference was that nobody came down that sandy road anymore. No threatening letters, no fake notices. No agents carrying clipboards, no people pretending they owned something that never belonged to them. The HOA had believed fear would make me leave. Instead, their greed exposed everything. And in the end, the beach cabin stayed right where it had always been, standing against the wind, the tide, and anyone arrogant enough to think they could take it.